Hello, everyone. I wanted to finish the Bill of Rights today with Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. So I see two questions there. One, maybe on the final, what's the text of the First Amendment? What does the First Amendment say? Maybe a little later on down the road, what are the 5 things that are protected by the First Amendment? So, religion, speech, press, assembly, and petitioning the government for a redress of grievances. So this really sets the stage here for very clear limits on the power of the federal government with regard to these things. So the First Amendment, it's remained unchanged since it was ratified, but with the rise of progressivism, actions that have been taken by Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court have really worked to undermine it. So as a result, the government we have today is able to exert an ever-growing control over the lives of American citizens. There you go. So what are the 5 things that it protects? Religion, speech, press, assembly, redress of grievances, petition for a redress of grievances. So this amendment was meant to protect us, we the people, from our representatives. Because when the government does something wrong, and they often do, and they can do some good too, I will cede that much ground. The people need to be able to express themselves. They need to be able to seek a redress of their grievances. Well, there was a search warrant. The agent knocked on the door. He searched your whole house and he only had a warrant for your bedroom. Okay, well, you can sue. You can seek a redress of your grievances through the court. The agent, just a hypothetical, exceeded the mandate of his warrant. So once, this provision was really the law of the land. It was the way it is, and it still is. And for many, many decades, Congress made no law that prohibited the freedom of speech, religion, etc. None whatsoever. It was a dead letter amendment, like Amendment 3 is now. And state and local governments also respected this amendment. But we live in a world now where there's a lot of legislation amending the First Amendment. And this has a considerable impact on the freedom of speech and the press. But the First Amendment itself has not been changed. It's still that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, etc., etc. So the First Amendment, while maybe a little overstated, it's on its way to the grave, but it's certainly on a decline. And this is thanks to politicians and the court's decision really to strike a balance between the rights provided for in the First Amendment and other imperatives of varying importance. So is our gradual abandonment of the First Amendment a good thing? No, I would personally say no. Are the principles articulated in the First Amendment good or bad? Well, we would have a discussion about this if we were all together, but it's just me sitting here, so I'm answering these questions that I wrote myself. You make the best of what this is. No, a free press is essential to hold the government to account. People need to be able to speak freely, to hold their representatives accountable. People should be able to seek a redress if a government wrongs them and if the government wrongs them in some way. There are no bad principles articulated here. There's nothing inherently evil about Amendment 1. It's something I think we should be grateful for, but, politicians in the courts and all that have disagreed, and we'll go into that. It hasn't always been an obvious thing in the long course of human history that the principles articulated in Amendment 1 were self-evident truths, that people had a right to speak their mind, that they had the right to worship God in their own way or not. Men have almost never been left free to practice what religion they wanted, or speak what they wanted, or publish what they wanted, or peaceably assemble, or not do any of those things. It was usually, and still is in many cases, mandated by the state that they do so. We just talked about Henry VIII and the Anglican Church. What do you think happened to the Catholics in England who would not conform, that the government caught? Off with their heads. Americans, our country, we're really peculiar in that regard. We used to be. Why did Americans once think that Congress should be prohibited from doing the things laid out in the First Amendment? Well, we're a country that values, that prizes self-government. Every principle laid out in this amendment is essential to our self-government. And the founders, believe it or not, maybe there are a few exceptions. Maybe John Adams Sr. might have been an exception to this. They didn't regard themselves as our rulers, our overlords, the people who know best. They were the people's representatives. They were responsible to the people. There were no ifs, ands, or buts about who the politicians worked for. There weren't even professional politicians, really. So this runs for about 5 minutes. It's, to me anyway, an interesting story about how the First Amendment developed and how we started putting restraints on it right from the start. This guy's name is Andrew Napolitano. Very wise man, in my opinion. This is the guy I sourced the Marbury versus Madison material from.
Eventually, those 10 amendments would apply to the states and thus to all governments, local, county, regional, state, or federal. Okay, so we'll pass through the Washington years, and we're in John Adams' presidency. His vice president is Thomas Jefferson. Now, they didn't speak to each other. They didn't speak in the 4 years that Adams was president and Jefferson was vice president. You remember how people were elected in those days. Everybody ran for president. Whoever finished first became president. Whoever finished second became vice president. Could you imagine if we had this in the modern era? Well, we don't. We have the 12th Amendment, which changes that. So the disputed election in 1800, when Jefferson would beat Adams, it was decided by the House of Representatives. But in 1796, Adams beats Jefferson. So things are going along pretty well until there appears in the countryside something that today is inconceivable. It was fear of the French. What the heck were they worried about? They were worried that Jefferson's friends in France would come to the United States, would become American citizens, and would vote out of office the big government federalists, the George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, big government, we love debt, sound familiar, political party that was running all three branches of the government, because Washington had appointed Federalist judges and Adams continued to do the same. The very, very famous Marbury against Madison case has to do with the appointment of a very low-level Federalist judge by John Adams. So anyway, they decide we're going to take care of this problem by enacting the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Alien and Sedition Acts would basically say, we have open borders and we can use people here. So if you want to come, come. But if you're French, you have to wait 14 years before you can become a citizen and vote. Then they added a most lamentable and unfortunate section to the
Here
Alien and
comes the
Sedition
speech
Act,
issue.
the sedition part of it, which basically said, if you articulate words that bring the president or the Congress or the government in general into disrepute, you can be prosecuted and convicted and incarcerated for 2 years. By the way, note who's missing from that list: president, Congress, government. The vice president is missing. Jefferson didn't want the freedom from criticism. He couldn't care less what they said about him, and said if he ever became president and this monstrosity was the law, he wouldn't enforce it. So question, how did the same generation, in some cases the very same human beings who wrote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, enact a law that did abridge the freedom of speech? I once put this question to my dear friend Lou Rockwell, and he said to me, the answer is what St. Augustine called libido dominandi. No, not that kind of libido, Lou. This is the lust to dominate. And with the exception of giants in our midst, like Ron Paul, this is a lust that afflicts almost everybody in the government. They want to use the power of the government to take away our freedoms, to enhance their own longevity and tenure in power, and tell us how to live. So were they phonies when they wrote, Congress shall make no law?
And I've had this conversation with a few of you over email since we talked about Congress and watched the Swamp mini documentary. It is part of human nature to want to control, to want to dominate. You might not have it. You might not think you have it. Okay, fine. But take my word for it. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, they all have it. And they all want to increase the power that they have. And that's just the government. And that's the type of people that typically run and get into these positions.
Abridging the freedom of speech, or did something happen to them by the time they made certain freedoms of certain speeches susceptible to prosecution? I'll tell you how frivolous this can be, and then I'll get to what I really want to talk to you about today, which is the just war. And Congressman Matthew Lyons was a Ron Paul type precursor who represented Vermont in the House of Representatives. He was an anti-federalist, a small government Jeffersonian, if you will. And he decided to test the limits of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he did so by insulting the president. Now, the president, John Adams, had a couple of aberrations, one of which, aside from his political philosophy, was that he could be seen walking around Philadelphia and eventually in Washington in a purple robe. And sometimes Mrs. Adams would sew gold epaulets on the shoulders of the robe, sort of hinting a little bit of an affliction to royalty. John Adams also had a problem that afflicts a lot of middle-aged men. He had a problem with his waistline. So Congressman Lyons decided he would challenge how serious the government was with the Alien and Sedition Acts by mocking the president's waistline. So in a public place, not on the floor of the House, because he'd be immune from prosecution for what he says on the floor. There's a long and interesting history behind that of British kings who executed members of Parliament because of what they said in the Parliament. But somewhere in a public place, Congressman Lyons referred to the President of the United States of America as his rotundity. And for that, Congressman Lyons was prosecuted in a federal court in Boston, was convicted of violating the Alien and Sedition Acts, and was sentenced to 2 years in a subterranean federal jail in a mountain in western Massachusetts. Now, if you are from Hudson County, New Jersey, or Chicago, or Boston, or New Orleans, you'll appreciate the second half of this Congressman Lyons story, because he ran for re-election to the Congress from his jail cell. And he won. By the time he gets out of jail as a re-elected congressman, he goes to Washington. His nemesis, John Adams, is in retirement, and the great Thomas Jefferson is president. We were at peace in the Jefferson years, but we were not at peace in the years of the president who followed him.
And we've had these type of discussions in the videos I've made. And how far is too far? You know, how much speech is far enough? How far should the press go? How far should the government be allowed to regulate this? You heard a story from the judge about the very same man who was responsible for creating one of the founders of the country, putting a limit on speech that was critical of him. Has this problem gone away? No one wants to be criticized. No one's immune from that. But, there are definite constraints upon Amendment 1 that started like 5 minutes after it was written. It was through these elected representatives that people govern the USA, we the people. And it was through frequent elections that people held these representatives accountable, be that your congressman, your senator, the president, whoever, your mayor. And there was every expectation that elections were going to be contested and that contested elections would turn on questions of principle. Now, how far have we fallen from that? I've talked to you guys enough about third parties and signature requirements in the state of Illinois, and it's nationwide. It's not just the state of Illinois. Do you know how many seats in the state legislature went uncontested in the last election in 2018? I'll tell you. Just in the House of Representatives alone, and I got this off media, which is a good source for things like this. In the Illinois House of Representatives down in Springfield, 54 seats out of the 118, which is about, I'll just do the math, just 45.7% of the seats were completely uncontested. How about the federal House? Not that bad, considering there are 435 seats. Number of seats uncontested by the other major party. Now, that's not saying a libertarian or a green or something might not have jumped in there, but by the other major party. So a Republican isn't contesting. Just 3. Democrats 40. Excuse me. But every race should be contested. So we've fallen pretty far. So people could not hold government accountable without free speech. And in the 18th century, as now, there were people who thought they knew what the interests of the people were better than the people themselves did. A la George III. I bet you could think of a few today. So they thought ordinary people needed tutelage from their betters. Nearly everywhere, the press was licensed, censorship was the norm, and even in the UK, where licensing of the press stopped being enforced, criticizing the government could still get you brought up on a charge of seditious libel, which is bad. You don't want to be brought up on that. So the First Amendment really presupposes that we, the people of the United States, can be trusted, and that members of Congress cannot be trusted, which I think is the right way around. And there's a reason for this, because people who hold high office don't want to be criticized. They want to be reelected. That's the name of the game. They prefer that there be no organized opposition. So giving Congress the right to abridge free speech would be like putting the fox in charge of the henhouse. It would, if you don't understand that analogy, it would just make a big mess of things and complicate matters. The founders firmly believed that it was the task of us, we the people, to hold our representatives accountable. And we can in no way, shape, or form hold office holders accountable if the office holders can regulate what we can say and do. People have to, and had to, and will continue to need to be completely free to express themselves, or a republic just isn't going to work. It's not going to work. Freedom of speech was meant to protect political speech. Freedom of speech was meant to protect my right to say that J.B. Pritzker is a terrible governor, or my right to say I think J.B. Pritzker is a wonderful governor. It's political speech. So George Washington, I mean, he didn't have artistic license or blasphemy, in mind, or thought that these things could be banned. It just never crossed his mind. Didn't cross the founders' minds.